Thank you, Deanna. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you, Rod and Mary Lee and Craig for your beautiful poems. It's a great pleasure to be here. I don't get to Ottawa very often, and it's a pretty terrific city. I walked down the Rideau Canal today, and that took about an hour. And then I went to the art gallery, and I looked around for about an hour, and then I walked back along the Rideau Canal, and that took another hour. So I've been on my feet for a little while. So I feel like I'm fading fast, but I'm going to try to hold on here. But it's a real pleasure to be here and to be invited here, a real honor. And I have to say, this is an absolutely beautiful space to get to read in. I love descending through the art gallery, and I have to say, I love these black walls, the sort of cone of silence that we get around them, and this kind of concentrated attention that they contribute. I think it's lovely. I don't know why you're laughing. I think it's lovely. So I'll be reading to you tonight from my second book, You Can Be My Yoko Ono. I'm kidding. That was a Stephen Page, Bare Naked Ladies, terrible joke. Omens in the Ear of the Ox. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, wave your hand if you can't, or throw something at me. And I'll just kind of jump right in. The book opens with the long poem called The Crossing. And I'll just read to you, it's written in 5 sections. And I'll just read to you the first section of the poem. And there's not too much that you need to know to be located in the poem, except that it takes place on a BC ferry. The speaker is returning to Vancouver Island, where he's presumably lives after some time away. And there's a reference in the poem to 2 poets who lived some time ago. One is Gerard Manley Hopkins, and the other is Robert Bridges. And many of us will have read Hopkins in one capacity or another today, but very few of us will have read Bridges. They were best friends when they were alive together at the end of the 19th century. And Hopkins died very young, in his 40s. This would be in the 1870s or 1880s. And he died in despair. He was a poet who had only published 2 poems in his entire life. And those poems were savaged by editors before they were published in the journals that they were published in, until they were no longer recognizable. Now, if you know Hopkins' poetry, you know that it has a deep Anglo-Saxon language. And it's a very kind of knuckled sort of language. But he was also, he was a scholar in Latin. And so what he did is he took these Anglo-Saxon words, this sort of core root of the English language, and he applied a Latin syntax to those words. And the result is an incredibly strange poetry. It feels sort of like barbed wire in the mouth. It's a very, very strange experience to read. Even today, it's rather alienating and difficult, but eerily beautiful, I think. Anyways, in his day, it was very strange. But he would send these poems to Robert Bridges, his best friend. And Bridges, by contrast, also a poet, was a very successful poet in his day. And they would exchange poems while Hopkins was alive. And Bridges would write critiques back to Hopkins about his poems that usually sounded something like, "If I never have to read this poem again, it will be too soon." Or, "Dear God, man, this is poetry in the worst sense of the word." Or, "Please don't send me any more poems." Pretty discouraging stuff, but they remained friends nevertheless. Now, when Hopkins died, he left Bridges his poems, and he said, "Please try to publish these." Bridges had a very successful career. We don't read him today because he's not very interesting to us. His poems tended to be the typical late 19th century poetry, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and on and on and on. But Bridges became Poet Laureate of England in 1902, which was the highest honor a poet writing in English could possibly achieve. And it was a position you would hold till the end of your life. Once you were Poet Laureate, that was it. You were at the top, and you stayed at the top. At that point, Bridges could have published his dear friend Hopkins' poems. He could have published them with the biggest house in England and promoted them and spoken well of his friend, but he didn't. He didn't publish Hopkins' poems until 1918, and when he did, he put them out with a very small press in a limited 200 edition run, because he had this sort of awkward embarrassment about the poems and about Hopkins' memory. When he did finally publish them in 1918, they were picked up by some young poets working at the time, some obscure fellows named T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and they were electrified by what this guy they'd never heard of was writing, Hopkins. and they started bending their style, and out of all this comes modernism as we know it today. In other words, Hopkins was a very, very, very important poet who was writing ahead of his time. What interested me about all this, I know this is suddenly becoming a very long introduction. I'm almost out of time here. What interested me about all of this is the strange flirtation that we as poets have with despair. Despair being, of course, the cardinal sin in the Catholic view of the world, because it denies the possibility of God's coming down and lifting you up. It's hopelessness. And Hopkins died in despair. Hopkins was a deeply religious man. He was a Jesuit. But he died in despair, believing that his gift had failed him and that he had failed his gift. But there is no truth in that at all. Bridges died in glory. Bridges was the most celebrated poet of his day when he finally passed away. And yet, he slowly slipped away into obscurity. So there's a sort of fable or a lesson to be learned there, and I'm not really sure what it is, but it was interesting to me at the time. The crossing. So, at the end of the middle of your life, you wake, rain shivering, to a white railing in a shriven dusk. A strangeness churning under the hull, the great blades boiling through ferruginous waters. So the ferries sail still in this late age, vast holds half full of souls. And so you rise each day more than you were. Exhausted, maybe, into silence. When Bridges wrote, "How is the world's bright shift held in such a cluttered line?" Hopkins, in a rage, had no answer, or none beyond his poetry. Rain in silver ropes overrunning his faith, his meter marking long, great gulps of night air. So the waters gulp at the mournful hull, so the rusted bolts bleed. You unfold both fists in the charred coastal dusk, watching a white chill krill across their skin. Bright shift, cluttered line. If the ill of the world issues up out of the world, then there is no course but to praise it, as Hopkins praised it. In the straits, a slack foam froths blackly in the scum, and you, who are water, stare at that water. Blurred by old hurts, praise holds no part in. Here, at the edge of a dark crossing that is always evening. As if called to account for a life lived in the provinces. But there is no calling to account. You sway at a railing staring west towards desolation, that is, forgetting. Books are about a lot of things, of course, but often what they're about for the writer is not necessarily what they appear to be about for the reader. And one of the things this book has been about for me is the struggle about singing in poetry. The elements that we use in singing in poetry, rhyme, for instance, meter, set forms, metrical lines, whatever it is, what the sort of tools that we have available at our disposal. And as such, there's the subject matter in several of these poems dances around this. And this poem is about Odysseus and the Sirens. It's, of course, a famous story to remind you. Odysseus is trying to get home from Troy back to Greece, but he's having a whole bunch of misadventures, and it takes him many, many, many years to get home to his beloved, which is where he's trying to get to. One of these adventures takes them past the island of the Sirens, and they know that if they sail too close, they'll hear the Sirens' beautiful song, which lures sailors into a kind of madness because it's such a sweet song, and the sailors are always tempted to jump overboard, swim for the island, and they inevitably drown. So what Odysseus, who's a clever, crafty sort of fellow, does is he has all the sailors fill up their ears with wax so they can't hear the song. but he wants to hear the song. So he has them tie him to the mast of his ship so that he can hear the song and he can't break free and plunge overboard. It's a flirtation with rhyme in a lot of ways in this poem. Odysseus and the Sirens. Here their fear churned him hard. That scarred, smoke-glarred strand burned like black shell. His men held their ears well stogged with wax and cut, dipped, dragged through froth, oar blades, old shafts gone gray, their knuckled backs racked by hard rowing, as, lashed fast, flowing with rope and roping his muscles in knots of their own cording, he, Odysseus, hung, leaned low, gasping at that beam, bloodied ears shunted shut, when came the breached dream out of the sea. Scorched wharves, slit fish noon-spackled with heat. Now was this land that he knew. Now, surging on past, could he make out white hills, sun-hammered, walls hazed in the blur, and his eyes afire hawked fast, hunted her. Not this, nothingness. This no song of wind and hiss and spray, gulls in tall gusts shoaling over shore rocks. In that rain-flared chop, their oars, all surge and scup of salt-stripped cedar, stopped. He stared back in shock. A battered beach, kelp-strangled, seethed with mysteries and wind-amped cries, damp with want. He shook then. He, ropes rent, shut his eyes. That land of stunned black sand was love, shore our horrors sing of. This is another poem about a Greek mythological figure. Daedalus was the father of Icarus. Daedalus was the greatest architect that had ever lived in the ancient world, evidently. And he designed the maze that the Minotaur ran around in on Crete. King Minos didn't like the idea of anyone knowing the secret of the maze except for himself and the Minotaur. So he locked Daedalus up in a tower with his young son Icarus, his assistant. He couldn't bring himself to kill Daedalus, but he didn't want him free to tell everybody the secret of the Minotaur's maze. Daedalus, of course, in this very famous story, designs wings, because he's a great architect, for himself and his son to fly back to mainland Greece. But he makes them out of feathers and wax, and he says to his son, don't fly too high to the sun, because the heat will melt the wax on the wings, and you'll plunge into the sea and drown. So they set off, of course, on this famous flight, and Icarus becomes so overjoyed with the extraordinary feeling of being aloft that he forgets his father's advice, flies too high, the sun melts the wax, and he plunges into the sea and drowns. And out of this, for 2,000 years, poets have derived a figure of inspiration. I don't know why we're gloomy folk. Icarus, this is a set the night before they set off, and it's in the voice of Icarus looking at his father, Daedalus. Icarus in the tower. As if winched in harness, he works late. His withered desks, worn olive wood, blurred. He works, all wax and bristling quill in the murky wine-dark shine. Oh, my strange, sad father, how he does not see me. Tangled in the bars of our cell, the lyred tendons of dried seabirds stretch or split or dangle over scrolls we sketched for lift. I lie like a coal in the dark straw, seething with light. I stare and I stare. He shuffles forth in his frail, creaking contraption, of leather-twined harness, rib-cross strap. In candle fire, he clips the brass buckles fast, the wings soft in the smoky burn. Then he turns, he mutters, he widens the twiggy, light as bone wingspan of his waddled arms. I watch his slack underskin shine. It is not the flesh that first must fly. When he stoops, blacking the light, bat-winged and magnificent, how I fear for him. Fear he lacks the recklessness this act will ask of us. All my life I have lived in shadow, knowing light does not keep, knowing what falls to the sun. All night now, each night, I watch the exquisite wax smolder and weep. This is a terrific stand, Rod. Oh my God, I want one of these for my office. I was talking to a poet friend of mine on the coast, and we were talking about writer's block. And she said, I never have writer's block. Whenever I don't know what to write about, I write about roadkill. This is Raccoon in Ditch. It's written in 3 parts. 1. Where seed-foaming weeds drag darkly, dusk rises in a last crunch of sunlight off fenders flaring west. You watch each tiny plicked claw stutter shut. A splayed, a stunned, so unskinned it seems but gleat-slicked gut. Innards peeled back like a glove lately worn, warm yet. Blood-dazed, black ants swarm like a hive of darkness. What you feel is love. How all things that live have inner halls light knows nothing of. How you are also of that dark. 2. Dragged from what black dream running, hurtled to what weed ditch. Gray fur, blood rubbed at its ribs, and seam split, that slow blue bubble of gut. A dead raccoon is dull and like any other dead goes stiff in its own thingness. Sticks can't shift it. Wasps lift past it, low in the pollen-stung air. Less than that, it seems. Unzippered, a purse of fur poured from itself. Gorged fat on day fire and grown beyond all size. Scraped up, a bucket's worth. But lumbering thick-shanked, fur-thighed, once its banded tail dragged fatly like a bull's phallus. At dusk, would slouch through a clatter of cans what sprawls now spoiling in groil and ooze, snout fanged yet, lips flensed back, flecked fur frothing with ants. What once could drown a hound thrice its weight. What are they? Night diggers, weasel gods, furred moons. Seen afar, they peer at us with the green eyes of children. Come dusk, their delicate hands could be human. 3. How you are also of that dark. How all things that live have inner halls light knows nothing of, like hives of darkness. What you feel is love, lately worn, warm with blood. Black ants swarm, all gleat-slicked gut, innards peeled back like a glove, a splayed, a stunned, and so unskinned it seems you are not you. tiny plicked claws stutter shut in a crunch and flare of sunlight. Fenders fade west, and there, where seed-foaming weeds drag low, something rises. There will be no other end to the world. It's a cheerful book, you know. 'Cause I'm a cheerful kind of guy. This is a prose poem written in the voice of a physician to a dying tyrant. Another cheerful poem. This is all right. Yeah, I'll just read it. You don't need to know anything more than that. Since you ask, like a viscous blue jellyfish, its tendrils adrift. That is how his wife's eye swims in that vase. Come, fetch me the colder basin. This heat could boil apart the bones of a lamb. His head aches. Oh, he is luminous with pain. They will not be cured by tea leaves or by figs. He is dying, waddling into a husk. He can no longer bear the red sun in the morning corridors, and he does not dream at all. Do you imagine it as guilt? He said to me, I have learned that the suffering of others does not exist. He said, at night, in the faint frescoes, I begin to see. Oh, such things he sees. I cannot begin to tell you. Yesterday, he stood at the window and told me, you would like to be useful, yes? In the courtyard, that blonde child polishing the stones. Bring her to me. And I'll just end with this this poem. It's called Ghosts. Ghosts. According to reports, during the closing days of the Second World War, residents of the Austrian village of Kassa were rounded up, marched into a nearby copse of birches, and shot through the base of the skull. The soldiers responsible, billeted in the houses of the murdered, almost immediately began to complain of certain unusual events. Silverware, furniture, dishes would move in the night. Shoelaces and socks would vanish. Small pieces of food would be found assorted along the mantels of fireplaces, in front of heating vents, under bookshelves. Footsteps, slamming doors, soft weeping, thumps in the walls. Such disturbances continued until 1964, when one of the houses was gutted for renovations. Workmen tearing open a brick wall in the attic discovered a small gray man living in the wall. In hiding since 1940, he had, over the years, excavated a complex passage of tunnels through the walls and floors. When they carried him out, he lay on the stretcher, shriveled and hairless and frightened. It seems he had not realized the war had ended. Since that time, 37 other survivors have been discovered. Unhappily, however, the hauntings continue. Thank you very much.